All right. So our next unit is the Métis. So this is a nice, short, and sweet unit, but it's also a fun one because you guys are going to be learning about um, some rebellions, some inner civil war. It is definitely a more fun topic. So obviously, we've talked about the Métis before, but this is online, if you guys need it, just know that the Métis are any First Nations and Europeans, okay? And a lot of the Métis that we're going to be talking about are those that are living in the Manitoba area. So about 4,000 Francophone Métis were in the region at the time. They were mostly Catholic and Canadian ancestry. So a lot of them kept their First Nations beliefs, and they lived where they call the Red River, and that is in the Manitoba area. So you can see it here. Most of the Métis were in the southern part of this area. So demographics, so country-born Métis. So there are some definitions, and there is a definition page for you, but just make sure you know the difference between countrymen and regulars. So these were First Nation women's and British traders from the Hudson's Bay Company. So country-born Métis were British and Hudson's Bay only. Okay, they were Protestant and they held some of their First Nations beliefs. So Métis are very interesting because depending on where their ancestry comes from, depends on some of their traditions, their values, and beliefs. So it's very unique culture. Roman Catholic missionaries arrived in the West in 1818. This is when they tried to convert First Nations into believing in their religion. They worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. They spoke French, English, some First Nations languages. There were Métis that at the Red River who had their own language as well. So first conflict. So there's a bunch of these Métis living in that Manitoba area. And a Scottish man, this guy, Mr. Lord Selkirk, he buys a huge piece of land from the Hudson's Bay Company. It is located where the Red and the Anishinaabe rivers meet in what we now know as Manitoba. So we know that there's a bunch of Métis there. He brings dozens of families from Scotland and where he's from. And what is happening is the Métis are being forced off their farms to make room for sheep pastures. So a lot of the Scottish at this time worked with sheep. So they wanted to turn this land at the Red River into a great farming company as well. They are taking it over. So the land that they have purchased was not empty. So there was people already living there. Obviously, the Métis did not like this. They were concerned. They own the land and they've been farming and living there for over 100 years. They knew that these colonists are going to push them off their farms. They were also concerned that their way of life would be overrun by British culture of the colonists. So this wasn't new. This is not something new that we haven't spoke about before. What other concerns? So if you remember the Northwest Company, which was the French version of the Hudson's Bay Company, which was eventually purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company, or they were also known as the Nor'westerners. They were allied with the Métis, and they also opposed the colony. They were competing, obviously, with the Hudson's Bay over the fur trade at this time. So they had taken the Métis side. They believed that the Hudson's Bay Company had sent the Scottish colonists to disrupt their trade. So in other words, basically get them to take over their land and their space so that the Northwest Company would fail. So this continues to go on. So the governor of this new colony was worried that the colonists would starve if too much buffalo meat left the colony. So in 1814, he banned the Métis from exporting any meat, fish, or vegetables from the Red River. This order was known as the Pemmican Proclamation. So that is something you need to know. It is one of our definition words. So make sure that you know that it was the banning of exporting meat, fish, or vegetables of the Métis. Still going on with those concerns for these poor Métis, the Northwesterners stole farm equipment and horses. They shot off their guns to frighten their settlers. A series of natural disasters, infestations, things were not going well. And in the summer of 1815, many of them loaded their belongings in canoes and they left. So this is one of the first battles that happens because of the Métis and the colonists. So this tension between the Scottish and the Métis is super high. The two face each other near, you can see in this map, this is another one of those complicated war maps, but if you take a look at it, it is pretty simple to see. You can see where you have the hard line of the Scottish and then you have the Métis lines on the other side. Angry words are exchanged and shots ring out, fierce fighting follows, and within a few minutes, one Métis and 21 colonists lay dead. Eventually, many of the key people involved were arrested and put on trial. So an investigation shows that these settlers were the first to open fire, and the issue divided the colonists and the Métis and the fur trading companies. So this was kind of one of those, not a huge massacre or a huge battle, but you did see the Métis kill a bunch of colonists, and we know that that's not going to make them very happy, right? The issue divided the colonists, the Métis, the fur trading company, blah, blah. The battle was the first time the Métis stood up as a united group against the Canadian government. So they're basically saying, hey, you guys can't be here. This is our land. Country-born Métis, so remembering those are the Métis that came from the Hudson's Bay Company, they actually join with the Francophone Métis and defend their common interests. So very interesting to see that French side Métis and that British side Métis say, hey, we're Métis, let's join together and try to fight for our rights. This begins the beginnings of the Métis Nation. So this Battle of the Oaks, if you're going to remember anything from it, it is the first time that the Métis come together and join together to fight for their rights. So then what happens? So you guys may see this assignment come up in the next couple days, and it's on the Red River Resistance. So how did it start? So these Red River Métis felt that Rupert's land belonged to them, right? They had been living there, made families, been farming, that sort of thing for over 100 years. However, the government of Canada was beginning to see that it was a good place to send some colonists. It was rich in farmland, there was lots of animals, and they believed that the Rupert's land wasn't good for farming, but scientists soon revealed otherwise, and soon Ontario settlers. So they eventually figure out that this is a prime place to live. Following Confederation, so after we become a country, the government began talks with the Hudson's Bay Company, and they strike a deal. And this is when Canada actually purchases the territory from the Hudson's Bay Company for $1.5 million. So this is the end of Rupert's land. They are buying the Hudson's Bay Company as a government and becoming part of the nation. First Nations and Métis living there felt uncertain about their future. They had not been consulted over the sale of the land, and the West belonged to them. It could not be bought and sold by outsiders. So remembering that First Nations way of life, they didn't believe in land ownership. And this really starts to strike up that idea for the First Nations and the Métis about assimilation. So remembering assimilation is that getting rid of their culture and trying to force them to become something they're not. So the Red River Resistance, the federal government sent survivors to the Red River. Their job was to prepare the land and expect a rush of farming colonists. The government did not warn the local First Nations and the Métis that surveyors would be coming in October of 1869. So a surveyor is somebody who goes and studies the land and prepares it for some form of farming or building. Like if you see surveyors now, they're usually mapping out where they're going to build new communities, roads, that sort of thing. So when the Métis see these strangers measuring lots along the river that they've been owning for over 100 years, they confront them and ask them to explain what they're doing. However, the surveyors spoke only English, and the French-speaking Métis could not understand them. So this is the first issue, is that they couldn't communicate. They sent for a former villager, a Métis man named Louis Riel, and I'm sure you've heard of him before. He is known as being either a Canadian hero or somebody who should be considered a villain for his actions, and we're going to talk about that too. He spoke French, English, and Cree fluently. Riel stopped the surveyors in their tracks and told them to leave the Red River immediately. So he was automatically kind of appointed by the Métis as one of their leaders at the time. I'm not too sure why it skipped for us. So Louis Riel and the Resistance. So the Métis knew that the surveyors would eventually come back and they would need to protect their land from the government. So the Métis were used to governing themselves. They had their own way of life. They set up this national committee to protect their rights to the land. Louis Riel became an important member of this committee. He was also a member of a well-known Métis family, and he was very well respected. Riel was a Catholic, and he had been studying to be a priest in Montreal. In December, he took control of Fort Garry, a major fur trade center in Manitoba, and then he establishes the Métis Provisional Government. So here's another definition for you. Provision means another word for temporary. So anytime that there is a provisional government, this government only comes into place for a specific time. So this would happen like if one of our leaders or our government fell apart or perished, we would put a government in place to kind of cover things until they could have another election, therefore. Okay, so provisional government means a temporary government. And they choose Louis Riel to be this person. And at this time, he was only 25 years old, but he was very passionate about his rights as a Métis. If you want to take a look at these pages in your Our Canada textbook, they're really going to help you understand the Red River Resistance. So when you're doing your assignment and you're doing the part where you have to go beyond the information, this is a good set of pages for you. The creation of Manitoba. So this conflict is going to lead to the prime minister at the time. So remembering from Confederation that John A. Macdonald, he was our first prime minister, and he wanted a solution and everybody to be happy when it came to the Red River. So the Métis government at the time sent these representatives to Ottawa with its Bill of Rights. So they designed this. We have the right to be this way. We have the right to govern this way. We have the right to speak this way, practice our religion this way, therefore. Okay, he meets with them, and most of the things on the list are agreed to. So in July of 1870, the government passes the Manitoba Act, which created the province of Manitoba. So this provisional government kind of set aside the way that that area was going to be governed, and the federal government agrees to it. Manitoba becomes the 5th province at this point in time to join Confederation in 1870. So we do have a timeline. So when we do look back at our timeline, we will put Manitoba as province number 5. So the Manitoba Act creates this 5th province. It had a provincial government. Both French and English would be used in all government courts, and the province would be able to send 4 elected members to the House of Commons in Ottawa. Basically, they're going to be part of the government, and there would be publicly funded school system, one Protestant and one for Catholics. It would be similar to what the system was in Quebec at the time. And an area of land would be set aside for the Métis to use. So they would take the land that the government had originally set aside for the colonists, and then it gave that land to the Métis. So almost like a reserve. The natural resources, so the economy, would be in control of the federal government. This meant that any unclaimed land, for example, belonged to Ottawa. The Canadian government promised to grant pardon to any Métis who had been involved in the resistance at Red River. So because they had killed 21 people, innocent people at the time. This was their way of saying, hey, we're going to forgive you for those actions. However, in the end, a pardon was not included in the Manitoba Act. So it was discussed, but I think when it came down to it, the idea of somebody dying kind of changed their mind. This is kind of the first time you see a compromise between the government and the First Nations. So that is a really good test question or analysis question. So if for some reason that comes up, that textbook page that just popped up is a good one to refer to. The second Métis uprising. So the creation of the province of Manitoba did not solve all these concerns for the First Nations. Even though they kind of had a say, they're going to start fighting back again. There's that idea and that fear of assimilation that is just not going away. So when Manitoba was created, land was set aside, but each family was supposed to receive this strip of land, about 240 acres. So that's quite a bit of land. But it did not work well, and many did not receive their land. So newcomers from the East did not show respect for the Métis identity and way of life, and they wanted to build a society in Manitoba that was similar to Ontario's. So they just totally disregarding the people that were living there at the time. And this is going to anger the Métis a little bit, and they're going to rebel again. So many of the Métis leave Alberta and move and start working somewhere else. And as buffalo began to disappear, the Métis returned to other ways of making a living, such as ranching, lodging, and running small businesses. By the 1880s, they faced a number of challenges in their way of life: starvation, poverty, and of course, the reduction of buffalo population. This was also going along for the First Nations as well. And in response, many of these First Nations and Métis had no option but to make treaties with the Canadian government. So they were kind of pushed into the corner. And if they didn't do something quick, their people were going to starve. Really, it came down to that. A lot of these Métis people felt that they were being cheated out of the land that was promised to them. It was unclear. Ownership was unclear. Property and land had also been claimed by the Hudson's Bay or the railway company. Newcomers were moving to the west like crazy, and they were feeling like they were just being overtaken. The Métis were big on the buffalo, and the buffalo supplies were big in Manitoba. But because all these people were taking farmland, the buffalo were displaced, and many of the buffalo ceased to exist in that area. The federal government is ignoring all these problems, so the Métis sends 15 petitions to Ottawa that were not answered. So just like with the Durham report, when they sent their resolutions to the government to try to change it in the rebellions, same kind of idea. These are the things on our concerns. What is the government going to do for us? They're scared that promises that the government is making is not going to be kept. They were also worried about the disappearing of the buffalo and overhunting. Remember that First Nations, they believed in hunting with the seasonal cycle. So that's why it's important for us to learn about that at the beginning of the year, so that we know that they respect the nature. And then when the Europeans come over here, all they care about is having their needs met, and maybe not so much sustaining those needs for a long period of time. First Nation leaders, they want a large territory where their people could live together. So their idea is to go to the government and try to get them some land placed specifically for them. However, what happens is they put them on reserves, and they're very small and separate from each other. So if we remember back from Unit 1, the First Nations, they worked with each other. They worked with other tribes and other cultures, First Nation cultures and that sort of thing to survive. And at this point in time, what the government does is kind of put them in an area and say, that's yours and that's yours. And it breaks that contact between each other. So Louis Riel, he returns, this little sneaky guy. So in the summer of 1884, a group of Métis led by Gabriel Dumont traveled to the United States, invited Louis Riel back to Canada. So Louis Riel actually escapes, and he goes to the US at the time because of what happened at the Battle of Oaks. So the Métis were angry and impatient that government was not doing what they were supposed to be doing, and they wanted Mr. Riel to be their voice. So he decides yes, and led by Riel, the Métis set up their own government at the community of Bactouche. If you remember Bactouche from grade 2, good for you. So from there, they send a Bill of Rights to Ottawa. So among the things that they want and the issues they want to be resolved, 2 provinces created the west of Manitoba. So they basically want, if you can see, this is the actual plan of attack of Bactouche. So this map on the side here actually shows you how they were going to go about doing this. When nothing happens, Riel suggests to take up this arms, so they're going to fight for it. So if you're not going to give us the land, we're going to take it. Many Métis did not want to battle because they knew they would be outnumbered. Right? We know that the Europeans were strong. So they call this, the second rebellion is called the Northwest Resistance. So there's also an assignment on this as well. So in 1885, it was very violent but brief. On the 26th of March, the Métis defeated a group of Northwest Mounted Police at a place called Duck Lake, forcing the police to retreat. And next unit, we're going to talk about who are the Northwest Mounted Police, what their job actually was, because even though they were police, they had a very different way of doing things back then. A few days later, a group of Cree joins in the resistance, and at Frog Lake, they killed 9 people and captured the police post. The police and neighborhood farm families were allowed to leave unharmed. So Louis Riel, he is going against the country, and he's doing it in a violent way again. Well, how does the government respond to this? So they rushed thousands of soldiers westbound to with the newly built railway, and an army advances on the Métis village of Bactouche. It wasn't long before the Métis ran out with bullets, and they were firing stones and nails. After 3 days of fighting, the 200 to 300 Métis and their Cree and Dakota allies surrendered, and the resistance war was over. A total of 53 soldiers from Ontario died in the fighting, and 118 were injured. 35 First Nations and Métis were killed. So this war that Riel starts ends with, at the time, a lot of people either killed or injured. I know it doesn't seem like a lot nowadays, but at that time, 53 soldiers was quite a few, and then losing 35 of their First Nations and Métis. So following the resistance, more than a dozen Métis ended up in prison. So because it's basically like a terrorist attack. It's a war against your own country. Louis Riel surrendered and stood trial for treason. He betrayed one's country. So at the time, treason happened a lot. And a jury actually finds him guilty, and he was sentenced to hang. So on November 16th, 1885, Riel was taken from his Regina cell and he was hanged. So the idea is that he was the first person to fight for Métis rights, but in reality, he actually commits a very high level of treason in a very violent way, and it ends in the loss of a lot of lives. So is he a hero or is he a rebel? So people in Ontario thought that this Louis Riel was a traitor and a murderer, and they wanted him hanged, but many other people believe that, especially the French Canadians, that he was a hero and thought of him as a defender of French language rights and of the Catholic religion in the West. So because of what he believed and fought for, people find him a hero. So I don't know if you guys remember, but you can look it up. There was a statue of Louis Riel a couple years ago taken down because of his violence. However, there was a big uproar because people do still respect him as somebody who fought for these specific rights. This gives the government the right to take over. So finally, in 1885, they respond to some of the demands of the Bill of Rights. And First Nations people in the West were punished for their role in the resistance. So if you were part of it, you were in trouble. Along with the Métis, 44 First Nations men were found guilty of these crimes. 8 of them were hung, and the rest were sent to prison. And only a few First Nations had joined the resistance, but whole communities were punished severely by having their government food rations stopped, even though in all Canada there were only about 100 buffalo at the time left. First Nation people were told to stay on their reserves unless they had permission from the government agent to travel. Insane. If you could only imagine having to ask your government to leave your city. These restrictions on the First Nations opened up the land to more European farmers. It also allows the government to continue expanding the railroad without fear of another resistance. So In a way, Louis Riel's rebellion kind of was a way of fighting for rights, but in the end, it actually turns out to do the opposite. So what happens from all this is the Métis become an independent nation, and they try to deal peacefully at this point in time with Canada. They want equal rights. They want people to join in, but the government is going to ignore a lot of these requests. The outcome of the resistance set back the Métis in their struggle to be recognized as a distinct people. The government of Canada, backed by the army, gained firm control of the West. So the Métis basically lose their rights at that point in time. And many of the issues that led to violence in 1885 would remain unsettled in the years to come.